For 3 years, American submarines had hunted alone. Now, 2 were together and communicating in secret by megaphone. It's shortly after midnight, October 23, 1944. USS Darter and USS Dace are lying to in Palawan Passage, 50 feet apart in the dark. Their commanders are shouting coordinates of a massive and strange target across the open water. They can't use radio. If the Japanese are listening, they'll give away their position. Both submarines kick to maximum diesel speed, racing north through total darkness, still close enough to shout between bridges. Neither crew knows yet what they've found, only that something very large is coming straight toward them. Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Rafael Benitez moved to Dace's radar scope. Blip after blip was already filling the display, more than he could count at a glance. Moments earlier, a dispatch had arrived from Darter, their sister ship, running patrol several miles to the south, that read, quote, "Fast ships on northeasterly course." By then, USS Darter and USS Dace had been patrolling the stretch of water for weeks, running wolfpack tactics borrowed from the Kriegsmarine and refined in the Pacific. Commander David McClintock commanded Darter with 81 officers and men aboard, while Commander Bladen Claggett commanded Dace with 74. The 2 commanders had worked together before and knew how to coordinate without spelling everything out over the radio. Their patrol area stretched between northwest Borneo and Palawan Island, a stretch sailors call the Dangerous Ground for its reefs and shoals. Most importantly, it was one of the few deep water routes from Japanese bases into the Philippine Sea. Everyone on board knew that any major fleet trying to reach the Philippines would have to pass through there. Until then, neither submarine had been especially successful. Darter had 2 sinkings on 2 previous patrols under a cautious older commander, while Dace had 3 total. Nevertheless, morale was high, with both officers and crew eager for action. For weeks, they'd been waiting for this very moment. The formation ahead was massive. 2 columns of warships steamed northeast at 16 knots. 11 heavy vessels and 6 destroyers with no advanced scouts protecting them. No screening destroyers pushed ahead. No patrol craft swept the flanks. The Japanese clearly suspected American submarines might be nearby, but for some strange reason, they weren't screening properly. Throughout the night, Darter tracked the enemy and reported their zigzag pattern, with McClintock transmitting continuous updates to Rear Admiral Ralph W. Christie, who relayed everything to Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the 3rd Fleet. The commanders made their decision. For the next few hours, they would shadow the enemy through Palawan Passage until at dawn, after visual confirmation, the attack would finally begin. McClintock and Claggett didn't know it, but the Double Ds had just found Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's 1st Striking Force, the most powerful naval formation Japan still had operational in the Pacific. Kurita was heading straight for Leyte Gulf to crush General Douglas MacArthur's invasion fleet. 420 transports, protected by 157 warships, beginning the liberation of the Philippines only days before. Now Japan was sending everything it had left to destroy those forces before they could establish a foothold. The fleet was built around 5 battleships at its core, including Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever constructed, each displacing over 70,000 tons and carrying guns so massive their shells were the size of small cars. 10 powerful heavy cruisers steamed alongside them, with light cruisers and destroyers rounding out a formation of 30 warships in total. Named Show 1, the first phase of Operation Victory, the overall plan called for Kurita to thread through the San Bernardino Strait and hit Leyte from the north, while 2 smaller forces attacked from the south. All 3 groups converging on the American forces at first light on October 25th, trapping them. Everything depended on Kurita reaching Leyte undetected. But American naval intelligence had been hunting Kurita's fleet for days, tracking him as he left his base south of Singapore before losing the trail entirely. Darter's contact reports changed everything. Kurita's position was now being relayed straight to Admiral Halsey, and 2 submarines were about to attack the largest Japanese surface force still operational in the Pacific. By 4:30 a.m., Darter had worked her way to a position about 20,000 yards ahead of Kurita's port column, with Commander McClintock ready to attack the lead ship, the heavy cruiser Atago, Admiral Kurita's flagship. At the same time, Commander Claggett would take Dace after the starboard column. Though the crews went to battle stations around 5 in the morning, The majority had already drifted toward the positions in anticipation. All over the submarines, torpedo men checked their tubes. Fire control operators ran through their calculations one more time, until at last, on both bridges, the commanders gave the order to dive. Darter was the first to submerge and vanish, followed by Dace a few minutes later. Inside their conning towers, target data computer operators called for ranges and bearings, calculating firing solutions based on enemy speed, course, and distance, the air growing thick and quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of electric motors and the occasional ping from the sonar. When Captain McClintock closed to only 980 yards, near point-blank range for a submarine attack, Darter fired all 6 bow torpedoes in rapid succession, the boat shuddering. The runtime was brutally short. It was seconds, not minutes, when the first torpedo struck Atago amidships with a massive underwater explosion that sent a geyser of water skyward. The second hit forward, tearing into her hull below the waterline. The third and fourth followed in quick succession, ripping open compartments and flooding her engine rooms. Following this thrilling victory, McClintock knew he should be lining up his next target. However, eager to see what he and his men had just done, he swung the periscope back toward Atago. As he later wrote of the breathtaking scene, quote, "Whip periscope back to the first target to see the sight of a lifetime. She was a mass of billowing black smoke, already going down by the bow." Inside and around Atago, countless fires raged across the superstructure, while smoke poured from ruptured vents. Her bow dipped lower with each passing second, as seawater flooded forward compartments, faster than damage control teams could respond. On her bridge, a shocked Admiral Kurita heard the reports, flooding in the forward magazines, in the engine rooms, power failing, communications down. The ship was listing hard to port and sinking by the bow. With no way to save his flagship and no time to transfer his staff, Kurita gave the order to abandon ship. Soon enough, officers and crew scrambled over the side, some jumping clear, others sliding down lines into the warm Philippine water. The Admiral himself went over with them, the commander of Japan's first striking force, now swimming for his life in the inky darkness. Destroyers raced in to pull survivors from the sea, but Atago was already going under. As Atago's bow plunged beneath the surface, while her stern lifted high into the air, before sliding under, taking 360 officers and men with her, Kurita was being hauled aboard a destroyer, soaked and shaken, his flagship gone, and much of his communication staff at the bottom of Palawan Passage. Rear Admiral Motome Ugaki, aboard the battleship Yamato, assumed temporary command, while his leader dried off and tried to piece together what had just happened. The first striking force had just been ambushed by an enemy they never saw coming. By this time, McClintock had already swung Darter around and directed his sights at the next ship in line, the heavy cruiser Takao, one of Japan's most modern warships, displacing around 13,000 tons and bristling with 10 8-inch guns. As 4 additional torpedoes raced toward her, 2 tore right into Takao's stern, blowing off her rudder and destroying 2 of her 4 propellers. Inside Darter, the crew heard the detonations and cheered, sure that Takao was already going down, just like Atago. However, Japanese heavy cruisers of that class were built with triple hulls, designed to absorb punishment that would sink most warships, and this ship lived up to that reputation, staying afloat despite the damage. Her crew fought to contain the damage, while destroyers moved in to screen her, until, slowly, and barely making 5 knots, Takao began limping southwest toward the naval base at Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers that peeled off from Kurita's formation until she was out of the fight. Miles away, Commander Claggett pressed his face to Dace's periscope, where he watched Atago's stern lift high in the air before sliding under, and Takao listing hard and trailing oil. All around them, Japanese destroyers raced in every direction, some picking up survivors, others sweeping desperately for the submarines they knew were out there but couldn't find. Gunfire erupted across the formation as paranoid crews fired at shadows, and countless explosions lit up the sky like the 4th of July back at home. According to the skipper, quote, "One is sinking and the other is burning. The Japs are firing all over the place. What a show." Now it was Claggett's turn to show off. Claggett swung the periscope toward the enemy's starboard column, still steaming northeast, studying the lead ships and calculating angles. Watching 2 ships pass by, She could see that the third ship looked massive through the lens, her superstructure rising high above the waterline, leading him to believe she was a Congo-class battleship. Though she was actually the heavy cruiser Maya, Takao's sister ship, in the chaos, there was no way to tell. From one moment to the next, the fire control officers began calling out ranges and bearings, while Benitez relayed everything to Claggett. When the target reached position, the skipper gave the order, and all 6 bow torpedoes fired in rapid succession. As these torpedoes splashed into the water, accelerating toward the Japanese column, Claggett ordered the submarine deep, dropping away from periscope depth while the crew braced for what came next. Then the ocean exploded. Dace bucked violently, the shockwave hammering through her pressure hull. Inside the control room, a depth gauge needle jumped hard and stuck. The overhead lights went out completely, leaving only the dim red glow of battle lanterns. Men grabbed for pipes and valve wheels. Feet slid on tilting deck plates. For several minutes, no one was certain whether those explosions had come from the target above or whether Japanese depth charges had found them. Throughout the boat, men checked their compartments, the hull plates, the seals, the valves, looking for the spray of a high-pressure leak that wasn't there. In reality, the loud crackling sounds that had terrified Dace's crew were Maya's bulkheads collapsing as the ship plunged into the depths of Palawan Passage. So loud, Benitez would later describe it as, quote, gruesome, akin to the noise made by cellophane when it's crumpled. On board Yamato, Admiral Ugaki watched through binoculars as Maya erupted in flame and smoke. By the time the spray and debris finally cleared, he stared at empty water and wrote in his log that, quote, nothing of her remained to be seen. As the sounds of Maya's destruction faded behind them, depth charges exploded around both submarines as Japanese destroyers tried to pin them down. Still, after about 90 minutes, the destroyers gave up and rejoined Kurita's fleet heading northeast. McClintock and Claggett then brought their boats to periscope depth once more, where they found Takao still there, dead in the water, with destroyers and aircraft standing guard. For 5 hours, they tried to get close enough for another attack, but had no choice but to wait for an opening. After sunset, both submarines surfaced and steamed side by side while the 2 captains made their plan, a surface attack on Takao after dark. But when they closed in, Takao was moving under her own power at 6 knots, heading southwest. McClintock and Claggett split their attack, with Darter coming from the east and Dace from the west. By midnight on October 24th, both submarines had been working non-stop for over 24 hours, mostly feeling their way through the Palawan Passage blind. But spending so much time submerged during daylight also meant navigators had no chance to fix their position against the mountains of Palawan rising in the distance. McClintock was navigating purely on calculated estimates, trusting his dead reckoning to keep Darter at least 7 miles clear of Bombay Shoal, when he suddenly discovered why this area was called the dangerous ground. At 12:05 in the morning, racing through total darkness, Darter suddenly hit Bombay Shoal at 17 knots, nearly full speed. The impact was massive. The submarine's bow rode up onto the coral with a grinding, screeching roar that tore through the hull. Men were thrown forward. The equipment broke loose. The entire boat shuddered as momentum carried her up and over the reef, coral scraping along her keel, until she came to rest, high and dry. With the bow out of the water and the screws exposed, it was clear Darter wasn't just aground. She was beached. The Sudan noise registered on the sound gear of one of the nearby enemy destroyers, which immediately began heading towards it, ready to pounce. Inside Darter, men scrambled to their feet and braced for the worst. If the destroyer found them stuck on the reef, there would be no escape. Fortunately, the destroyer couldn't detect what had happened. It closed to within 12,000 yards, engines churning, then turned away. When the Jap destroyer faded on our radar screen, we breathed a little easier and went to work in hopes of floating her off at high tide. Reacting swiftly, the crew threw everything movable overboard, from anchors and food to furniture, and basically anything that could lighten the load. Even the stern torpedoes were fired, jettisoning several tons of weight. The crew gathered on the submarine's stern, trying to shift the center of gravity. Some men ran from port to starboard and back again, attempting to rock the boat free. Nothing worked. The tide came in and went out, but Darter didn't budge. She was stuck, her bow pointed skyward. Aboard Dace, Commander Claggett received the message and changed course immediately. Takao would have to wait. as there was no question of leaving McClintock and his crew stranded on the shoals of Palawan Passage. Dace moved slowly and cautiously toward her beleaguered sister's position, as Claggett had no desire to run his own boat onto a reef in the dark as well. McClintock's voice carried across the water, shouting warnings telling him not to come too close and to watch out for the reef. Dace crept forward until she was within 50 yards of Darter's stern, where he could see there was no doubt Darter was finished. With this, the crew began burning secret documents and destroying vital equipment. Sledgehammers smashed the radar and radios into useless scrap. Codebooks went into weighted bags. Both submarines inflated their rubber rafts, and Darter's crew began the slow transfer to Dace. In the pre-dawn hours, small figures climbed down Darter's side into rubber boats waiting below. Minutes later, they reappeared at Dace's hull, where hands reached down and hauled them aboard. Each raft held only 6 men, which meant 2.5 hours were needed to transfer the entire crew across the dark water. In the end, McClintock was the last man to leave his boat. Lifted aboard Dace, his first light began to break over Palawan Passage. As he jumped onto the sister ship, McClintock reported that he'd already set Darter's demolition charges, 50-pound explosives installed in every submarine for situations exactly like this. Claggett pulled Dace away at full speed, putting distance between his boat and the coming explosion that would blow Darter apart and send her to the bottom. One charge detonated with a pathetic pop that echoed across the water, followed only by complete and utter silence. Darter sat intact on the reef, exposed and vulnerable, and if Japanese forces found her like this, everything inside would fall into their hands: codes, equipment, intelligence. But Claggett still had 4 torpedoes remaining, and he fired 2 at Darter's beam, surrounding the stranded submarine and explode uselessly against the reef. He maneuvered Dace directly astern and launched the final 2 torpedoes. These also detonated against the reef, without ever reaching Darter's hull. She was simply sitting too high out of the water for the weapons to reach her. With the sun starting to rise over Palawan Passage, the 2 commanders made their call. Dace's deck gun would have to finish what the torpedoes couldn't. Getting the gun crew topside meant exposing 25 men on the surface during daylight hours, where a Japanese destroyer or aircraft could catch them, with nowhere to run and no time to dive. But the leaders both understood that Darter couldn't be left intact for the enemy to board and salvage. The crew climbed up through the hatch, and the deck gun opened fire, sending shells crashing into Darter's superstructure. Round after round punched through the hull in rapid succession, hitting the metal repeatedly and tearing apart whatever remained of her radar and bridge equipment. The gun barked 21 times before ammunition started running dangerously low. The crew was focused entirely on their gunnery, methodically dismantling their sister submarine piece by piece, when the radar operator's voice suddenly cut through the intercom. An aircraft was approaching fast. Claggett's order sent 24 men scrambling for the single hatch on the conning tower as Dace began to submerge. The opening was barely 2 feet wide, and chaos erupted on deck as men climbed down the hatchway, while others fell sideways, dove headfirst, or were shoved down in a heap by those behind them. The officer at the deck slammed the hatch shut just seconds before the boat went under, leaving the crew with nothing worse than bruised shins and mashed fingers. Above them, the approaching pilot spotted 2 submarines, one motionless on the surface, the other diving fast. He chose what looked like the easier target and dropped his bomb on the grounded submarine before banking away, unaware Darter had already been abandoned. The explosion brought relief to everyone packed inside Dace's hull as the plane disappeared over the horizon. With nothing left to do, Claggett set course for Fremantle, Australia. Dace now carried 155 men, 81 officers and crew from Darter, crammed in alongside her own complement of 74. Submarines were tight quarters under normal conditions, but this was something else entirely. The journey to Fremantle stretched across 11 days that must have felt considerably longer for the men sleeping on empty torpedo skids and wedging themselves into any available space they could find. By the final days, the galley had run down to nothing but peanut butter and cream of mushroom soup. Still, the voyage passed without incident, and when Dace pulled into Fremantle on November 6th, the entire crew felt the weight lift as they finally stepped ashore. 2 of Japan's heavy cruisers had been sunk, and a third sent limping back to port. Every single man from both crews had made it home alive. But what they'd done in Palawan Passage had set everything else in motion. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later called Darter and Dace's radio messages, quote, the most significant reports of the Pacific War. Around midday on that same day, a dispatch reached Admiral Kurita from Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo that read, quote, it's very possible that the enemy is aware of the fact that we have concentrated our forces. The Admiral scoffed. He didn't need Takeo to tell him that. 3 of his cruisers were gone, including the flagship he'd been swimming away from hours earlier, and the same American submarines that had ambushed him in the dark had certainly transmitted everything to the enemy. Sure enough, Admiral Halsey knew exactly where Kurita was headed, so when his battered formation steamed through Palawan Passage into the Sibuyan Sea, Halsey's carrier aircraft were already inbound. Wave after wave of American planes descended on the Japanese ships, concentrating everything on Musashi. A total of 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs found her hull over the course of hours. And still, she refused to go down, her crew fighting to keep her alive long after any other ship would have been lost. In the end, the largest warship ever built rolled slowly onto her side and slipped beneath the Philippine Sea, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita reversed course as the battle turned against him, by now running 7 hours behind schedule, his carefully coordinated plan coming apart at every seam. His diminished but still dangerous fleet finally reached its target on October 25th, intercepting 6 escort carriers under Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague off Samar Island. Sprague's ships were hopelessly outmatched, and his destroyers and destroyer escorts charged Kurita's battleships with torpedoes in a desperate, almost unthinkable bid to buy time, smaller ships throwing themselves at capital ships to protect the men on the beaches. 1 American carrier went down, along with several escorts. Then, with the invasion beaches lying nearly defenseless ahead, and victory finally within reach, Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw. The ambush in Palawan Passage still haunted him. Without the communications staff that had gone down with Atago, he remained convinced that Sprague's small force was merely the advance element of something far larger, waiting just beyond the horizon. Rather than risk everything, he turned his ships around and steamed away from Leyte Gulf, away from the beaches, away from MacArthur's forces, away from the victory Japan had thrown its entire remaining fleet to win. Of the 64 warships that had sailed into battle, 26 would never return home. MacArthur's landing forces remained untouched on the beaches. Japan had thrown everything it had left at the American invasion and failed. It had all started with 2 blips on a radar screen, a megaphone call between bridges in the dark, and 2 submarine commanders who had no idea what they were sailing toward. Darter was rusting on a reef in Palawan Passage, but what she and Dace had set in motion 2 days earlier, a contact report, a spread of torpedoes, an Admiral pulled soaking from the water, had just decided the fate of the Pacific.